challenges from the genocide against the Tutsi 31 years later. The prevalence of the genocide ideology that led to genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda is still being spread in neighboring countries and beyond, taking advantage of social media and networks of genocidaires and their supporters, especially in Western countries. This, of course, affects negatively the positive gains registered in Rwanda. After the defeat in July 1994, those responsible for the genocide fled mostly to the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, then Zaire. In the DRC, they were given heaven and support to reorganize and establish bases in the eastern provinces of North and South Kivu, from where they mobilized local population to kill and commit ethnic cleansing of Congolese Tutsi. This resulted in the mass exodus of Congolese Tutsi and Banyamulenge fleeing into neighboring countries, including Rwanda, where until now, thousands have been living in refugee camps for the last 30 years. These negative forces, the Force Démocratique pour la Libération du Rwanda, as they call themselves, remain a permanent and existential threat to Rwanda. They have launched several terror attacks on Rwanda with the support and cover from the DRC government and its armed forces and local ethnic groups called Wazalendo. And this is being done in sight and knowledge of the international community and UN forces on the ground. The current security situation in East DRC must be understood in this historical context. And any attempt to find a solution must deal with its root causes through an honest political dialogue and a strong commitment to implement agreed agreements. 31 years ago, the international community turned its back on Rwanda. That's a fact. Failing to prevent or at least stop the genocide when it started. The current situation in East DRC presents similar signs that the ones we observed before the genocide in 1994. Genocide ideology against Congolese of Tutsi, genocide ideology against Congolese of Tutsi affiliation is being spread in the public through the dehumanizing language, such as calling them snakes, devils, hypocrites, foreigners. There are also propaganda messages specifically tailored to instill hate. Phrases such as poison rwandais, le Tutsi est né criminel, les FARDC, those are Congolese armed forces, sont faibles, les FARDC sont faibles car infiltrés par les Rwandais, meaning military from the Congolese, the Rwandophone Congolese, il n'existe pas de Tutsi congolais. La guerre sera longue et populaire, etc., etc. Ces messages haineux, souvent véhiculés par des dirigeants de premier plan de la RDC, comme l'actuel ministre de la Communication, Patrick Mouyaya, le ministre de la Justice, Constant Mutamba, le député Bitakwira du Sud Kivu et d'autres, sont bien connus de tous. As a result, Rwandophones in Congo, Congolese Tutsi or with similar futures are targeted, killed, burned alive, and you have seen scenes where human flesh is being eaten in the daylight, and videos recorded and published. These acts are unchecked by the international community, and authors are guaranteed total impunity by the DRC government. Also, I am aware that Rwanda and Canada don't have the same understanding of the security situation in East DRC for now, and I hope for the best in a new future. Le Rwanda et le Canada ont travaillé ensemble pour inclure le concept de responsabilité de protéger dans les missions de maintien de la paix. Mais malheureusement, nous avons récemment assisté à des scènes où les forces des Nations Unies, après plus de 25 ans de présence en RDC pour éradiquer les FDLR et d'autres forces négatives, ont plutôt soutenu militairement une coalition dont la force de frappe principale est constituée par les mêmes FDLR. Le cas du général Gakwerere, un des leaders des FDLR, parti du Rwanda au grade de lieutenant après sa participation au génocide au sud du Rwanda en 1994, et qui a été capturé par le M23 pendant la bataille de Goma en janvier 2025, en dit long. Cette 31e commémoration est aussi une occasion de rappeler que tous les pays du monde doivent combattre toute forme de négation du génocide, de poursuivre les auteurs du génocide partout où ils se trouvent, soit les extrader au Rwanda pour leur jugement, ou alors les juger dans les pays qui les abritent en exécution de la résolution numéro 2150 du 16 avril 2014 du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, let me thank you again for your presence that we value very much. Many thanks to Assistant Deputy Minister Cheryl Urban and your colleagues from Global Affairs Canada for your participation today. I heard very recently about the Caretaker Convention in Canada during election time and its implications when it comes to government engagement, and I fully understand. I want to thank also Gustave Mukurarinda, who is here present, and Major Philip Lancaster, who have generously accepted to share with us today their personal testimonies and their experiences. Un grand merci, bien sûr, va aux organisations des Rwandais vivant ici au Canada pour l'appui dans l'organisation de cette commémoration. Je veux citer ici Humura Association, Rwandan Community Abroad, Peace and Love Proclaimers, Prime, les jeunes volontaires que vous avez vus, mais aussi les poètes, les artistes et autres. D'autres activités seront organisées au Canada durant les prochains 100 jours et notre mission les soutiendra autant que possible. Finally, Rwanda reaffirms its commitment to play its rightful role among the international community in fighting genocide ideology and preventing genocide, ensuring that never again translates into actions for generations to come. Thank you again for your attention. Merci beaucoup. Murakoze cyane. Twese twibuke twiyubaka.
Merci, Votre Excellence. Nous allons maintenant regarder une vidéo sur l'éducation à la paix ainsi que la consolidation de la paix au Rwanda. Merci de porter votre attention aux écrans.
Please bring your attention to the screens as we watch a short video on peace building in Rwanda.
Batuma kuntera hamwe maze tumanuke kuko
muzi yuko ari inyenzi ziri mu gihugu
imbunda ntikomeze kuba umusirikare gusa
ejo n'ejo bundi akantu kateganyijwe muri mujyi wa Kigali
ngira ngo abantu benshi bavuga ngo genocide ngo ni umujinya w'abantu ngo bagize kubera indege wasubira inyuma yabona yuko bidafite n'ishingiro kubera yuko hari n'ibindi bintu byinshi byari byarakozwe mbere yayo nk'ibitekerezo bipfobya, ibitekerezo birenganya, bipyinagaza.
Iriya hanuka ry'indege ntabwo ari impamvu, ni imbarutso. Gusa perezida bapfuye mu bihugu bingahe ku isi barabarika. Ibihugu byapfuyemo abaperezida ni byinshi ariko ntibigeze haba genocide.
Abanyarwanda bajya gucikamo ibice, icya mbere ni politike y'imiyoborere. Abakoloni, ababirigi bashakaga gushaka abakozi bo kubakorera akazi bitasabye yuko bashyiramo amafaranga menshi. Bagombaga rero gufata igice kimwe kigakora akazi, hakagira n'ababikoreshwa. Hanyuma rero igihe cy'ubukoloni burimo gusa nk'aho burangira, ngo kubera ababirigi babonaga inyungu muri Kongo kandi bakumva kuzagezegeraho bazajya baca mu Rwanda, baravuze ngo b'abatutsi baduhaga raporo y'uko akazi kameze cyangwa tukabakubita nabo batagakoresheje, ntabwo bazatwemera ko u Rwanda turukoresha, tugumya kurugira akarima dukoreramo ibyo twishakiye. Niyo mpamvu bazafata ya makosa yose bakoze muri cya gihe cy'ubutegetsi bwabo bakayatereka ku mitwe y'abatutsi, bagatangira kwigisha abahutu ngo mu bahutu mwe abatutsi mwabonye ko ari babi.
Mu gihe cyo kujya ku bwigenge ubutegetsi bwarahawe abavugaga ngo ni abahutu batsikamiwe bagomba kwigaranzura abatutsi. Parme Hutu ni kivuga ni Parti pour l'émancipation des Hutus. Aho kugira ngo aba ari u Rwanda ruhabwa ubwigenge hakabaho kwigaranzura kw'abahutu, u Rwanda twabaye nk'abarwibagiriwe ahantu.
Uruhare rwa Parme Hutu mu gucamo ibice abanyarwanda, unashatse watangira kururebera mu madisikuru perezida wa repubulika yakundaga kuvuga. U Rwanda rwahawe ubwigenge, yavuze ijambo rirerire, ariko mu kurisoza aravuga ngo ndarangiza iri jambo ryanjye mbwira igice kimwe cy'abanyarwanda bitwa abatutsi. Izina umututsi ntibivuze ubutegetsi no gutungwa n'imitsi y'abandi, handitsemo icyanditse mu moko yose. Mwoye gukomeza kurema agatsiko k'ubwibeshye n'uburyarya n'ubwirasi bidafite aho bishingiye. Uyu perezida Kayibanda yari afite korali yitwaga Abanyuramatwi, yaririmbaga turatsinze gaye turatsinze Kamarama kayitora pariti zose zifuje yahariwe Parme Hutu. Igihugu cy'urumva ari icy'abanyarwanda bose cyangwa igihugu Rwanda yabonye bene yo gahutu ganza ntamaka. Abanyarwanda batangiye kwicwa 1963 hapfuye abatutsi barenga 35 mu gihugu hose. Bakubwira ko Nyabarongo est devenu la charrie des cadavres. Nuvuga ngo Nyabarongo yabaye nk'akamoteri gasunika imirambo.
iwacu mu bufundu muri Gikongoro habaye ubwicanyi bukabije, ndetse n'itangazamakuru mpuzamahanga byatangiye kuvuga ko ce sont des actes de génocide.
muri sosiyete nyarwanda no kwiba amagi ntibashoboraga gupfa kuhivana, ahubwo kwica umututsi bihinduka nk'ahatari icyaha. Umututsi watwikiwe inzu, wiciwe cyangwa watangiye gutemwa, yahunga nta nubwo bavuga ko yahunze, bavuga ngo yacitse.
muri 73 rero Kayibanda ubutegetsi bwe bwari mu marembera, imanda yari irimo kurangira, igisirikare kitakimwumva, amahanga atakimwumva. Igisubizo yagishakiye mu kwirukana abatutsi mu gihugu. Kuri 26 z'ukwezi kwa kabiri 1973 habaye ikiswe mututsi mvira.
Parime hita yivuriyeho haza Habyarimana, ati ubumwe n'amahoro. Cyahehe ubumwe n'amahoro, yigume muretse gupfa, ariko ngiye kubereka iringaniza rya hehe. Ubonye ko riringaniza, ahubwo yakoze ivangura ryitiringaniza.
Habyarimana atangira na disikuru yo kureshya abantu, akabwira ati murica abasobukwe, murica ababyara banyu, ko mwashingiranye mwashaka iki? Abantu bakagira ngo ni iby'ukuri bimuri mu ndani y'umutima, naho arashaka kuganya abaturage ngo moko yose amukunde, tutazi ko azategura we ibirushije.
Leta ya Habyarimana yakomeje muri uwo murongo wo gucamo abanyarwanda ibice. Mbere na mbere mu mashuri amateka yigishwaga yabaye amateka yigisha amacakubiri, ko abatutsi baturutse muri Ethiopia, abahutu bagaturuka muri Chad.
icyo gihe ni ukuvuga ko twebwe abaturage bagombye gukora, tugomba kwikorera izo ngegera tukazitsemba.
Yenda kumenyesha ko abanyari muri Ethiopia ko tuzabanyuza muri Nyabarongo mukagerayo bwangu.
Bitwigaga turirimba amahoro, ubumwe n'amajyambere, wagira ngo kuko byari bihari, ariko buriya jenoside yari imeze nk'umuriro w'umunyotwe worosheho ivu, kuko mu bayobozi hejuru byaravugwaga yuko hagize ikiba abatutsi bakwicwa.
Habaga raporo de la rentrée scolaire, raporo ya buri gihe, bakamenya abakozi, umubare wabo w'abatutsi n'uw'abahutu, bakamenya n'abatwa babashyiragaho ariko ari formalite, bakamenya abana. Noneho kwari ugutegura urwango, umwana agakura azi kuriya badahuza ubwoko.
Nk'urugero naguha kuri ubwo gushyirwa mu bikorwa kwiringaniza, twebwe iwacu Byumba hariya nta batutsi twiganaga nabo. Uwo twiganaga kubera twirwaga tumutuka tumuserereza tumaze kumenya ko ari umututsi, ari mwarimu bitubwiye wowe kwa kanaka iwanyu muri abatutsi, ndetse uzarebe na cyasokuru ukuntu kigenda gihese umugongo, mwe murabo mu muryango wo kwa Kanjogera. Uwo mwana twahereye icyo gihe tumubuza amahoro, yaza ngo musangire ku gasuru wapfunyitse, cyangwa twari dusanzwe dusangira impamba, dutangira kumuheza, agezeho atwibuzemo ishuri arareta arataha.
Rero inkotanyi zarateye, kugira ngo hari kuwa mbere niba nibuka neza, itariki ya mbere y'ukwa 10 mu ijoro ry'uwa kane, mbona umujyi wose ikirere cyabaye umutuku, nyine amasasa acanamo. Noneho uracya ku itariki ya 5 batangira kugenda bafata abantu bitaga ngo n'ibyitso by'inyenzi.
Inkotanyi zimaze gutera, nk'uko bagombaga gushaka izindi ntwaro, habayeho gushakisha intwaro z'umutwe. Basaba abantu baririmbaga n'abandi bose barahamagaza bati buri munyarwanda nahimbe indirimbo yo gufasha igihugu guhangana n'umwanzi. Birakomeza kugeza kuri iye tubatsembatsembe, iye tubagandagure. Kumva indirimbo yo kwica ngo tubatsembatsembe ikwira ikava Ibyumba ikajya Icyangugu, ikava Icyangugu igataha Ikibungo, ikava Ikibungo igataha Igisenyi. Ibyabwo icyo bivuze.
Inkotanyi zikimara gutera, propagande mediatike no kuri radiyo y'igihugu yari ihari. Inyangarwanda, Imburagasani, banzi b'igihugu, ibyo byarabaye.
Buriya amategeko 10 y'abahutu ko yasohotse muri Kangura ntabwo yasomwe n'abantu benshi. Yaje kumenyekana mu banyarwanda kuko radiyo Rwanda itari yaba RTLM yaje 1993. Radiyo Rwanda yagiye ibicishaho ikabisobanura.
Itangazamakuru bisa naho ryahindutse gatoya guhera amashyaka menshi avutse, niho havutse umunyamakuru bwinshi. RTLM rero yaje ishaka kuvuga ibyo radiyo ya leta itavuga.
kuva rtlm haha ni materi nawe yasomye ku kamogi mu gitondo nibyo shaka bimuhaburuza
ndibuka hari igihe yigeze gukora eshanje kugurana porogaramu n'abantu bo kuri Muhabura. Icyo gihe bari baramaze gusinya Arusha. Uwitwa Kantano cyangwa ni Noheli yashyizeho indirimbo ivuga ngo turaje tuje tujya iwacu, aratangira kuramo ngo baraje nyine, ngo n'ibizungerezi byabo, ngo ubwo abahutukazi mube mwiteguye, ngo ibitanda byanyu mubiveho, ngo bamutetere na bamutemba nshyushyu. Ndabyibuka neza rwose icyo kiganiro. navuze nurumva di indirimbo nziza arayishe, ibintu byiza baririmbaga tuje tujya iwacu arabihinduye bibi ku buryo n'uwari wabyumvise wenda wari kubikunda arabyanze. Kubera iki? Ya propagande azi ukuntu ari bubikore bya bindi byose ibyara amata agasukamo amasazi bikaba bibi.
hari ikintu gikomeye cyakoreshejwe nubwo kidasanzwe mu banyarwanda, n'ibishushanyo caricature byarakoreshejwe cyane muri Kangura kuko zashushanyaga ibintu by'urukozasoni ariko bifite ya message. Reka wenda mvuge nk'ishusho imwe yo muri 1993. hari ishusho rero ubonaho inkotanyi n'umukuru wazo icyo gihe Paul Kagame bavuga ngo inkotanyi turatashye. Noneho uwari bashushanyije ujya kureba ugasanga umuhanda bagendaho ntabwo ari umuhanda, ni za cercueil. Bo baravugaga ngo dore ikinyenzi zizasanga.
mu kwezi kwa mbere 1993 bagosora avuga ngo bagiye gutegura imperuka Kibirira, Bigogwe, ku Kibuye, mu Bugesera abatutsi barishwe barasenyerwa, ntabwo indege yari yaguye.
umunsi wo kwa gatanu rero niwo munsi mubi twagize mu yindi yose, kuko haje imbunda zidasanzwe, haza abantu badasanzwe, bari bafite imbwa, bafite umuriro, bafite n'ingoma. Twabonaga ibyo bintu tukarira nta muntu kugezeho. Bamwe bananirwa no kugenda bicara hasi baraza babatema. Abantu barabica, umusozi wose uhinduka imirambo, imigezi yose yahindutse amaraso. Baratemye icyo gihe umuntu wese warokotse uwo munsi yarokotse azi yuko ari we wenyine warokotse.
baraza bati pawa Hutu pawa, Mututsi wize gira isoni, uwacuruje yazane, umutindi yahure pawa, ibikombe by'imisozi biti pawa, ekonziga ukagira ngo niyo musizi rukabatuye.
akaradiyo ku gutwi n'umupanga mukundi kuboko. akaradiyo hano ni uko intera yawe neza, akaradiyo ku gutwi yumva yaritereyemo ukuboko ujya gufasha umupanga.
twasohotse mu kiliziya batera indirimbo ivuga ngo twaremewe kuzajya mu ijuru. mama yarayiririmbye kandi yari umuporoso nawe yasubiragamo. abantu barasohoka, noneho bamaze gushira mu kiliziya abantu bose babandagaza aho mu mbuga. hanyuma hakurikiraho ikintu cyo kuvuga ngo abagore mwicara aha, abagabo ikintu cyitwa umuhungu, umugabo, umuhungu, umwana w'uruhinja w'umuhungu babashyira ukwabo, nibo batangiriyeho kwica.
papa bamwica bamuciyemo kabiri, bakavuga ngo reka bareba ko atava amaraso ava amata, kuko bari bazi ku rugo rwacu bari amata. bamuciyemo kabiri bamujugunya muri uriya mugezi wa Nyabarongo.
Bari bafite ubugome budashobora kumva, bari bafite ubugome ku buryo ntabwo kwica byari bibahagije, bongeragaho ikintu cyo kubabaza umuntu kugira ngo apfe nabi.
Buriya jenoside ifite ukuntu iteye, navuga ngo nabi, no kuyihakana bikaza muri uwo murongo. Buriya harimo impamvu ebyiri zibitera. Imwe niyo ngiye kwigira intungane, kwigira innocent, kwigira inzirakarengane, ariko harimo n'indi yo kuvuga ngo n'umwana wanjye uzakura atazavuga ko nari umugome, ko nari mubi. Ntabwo wategura ikintu ngo gikore bagikore ureba ngo nurangiza uvuge ngo nticyabaye. Barabizi.
Next, we welcome Gustav Mukurinda. Gustav is a survivor of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. He has dedicated himself to educating the world about the genocide's lasting impact, as illustrated in his memoir, The Snowfall, which blends personal experiences with historical context. Told from a perspective of an 11-year-old, his narrative honors the victims, the heroes of the RPF Inkotanyi soldiers, and the resilience of survivors, urging remembrance as a foundation for peace, unity, and compassion. Welcome, Gustav.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share my story. It's hard to say after watching that video because one of the people we saw testifying, Beata, she was the colleague of my father. They were both teachers, and she was my first teacher right after the genocide when I returned to school. Okay. So I'll start my story on April 5th. And April 5th, I woke up, I was 11 years old, and at my home, at our house, it was so busy, they were preparing for some guests, and I did not know who they were. And I tried to ask my siblings, my older siblings, who they were preparing for. They told me they didn't know. Just a few hours later, we saw an old man came to our house, and I've never seen my father and my mother excited. They were so happy, they were just like kids. And then I heard my father calling this man. I heard this man calling my father, my son. And I was like, who's this person? Because I thought my grandfathers were killed, both of them. I didn't know they were killed, but I knew they went to heaven. That's what they told us, because they never told us exactly what happened. And I saw this man calling my dad, my son. And then he called my mom, my daughter-in-law. And we were all confused, me and my siblings. No one knew what was happening. And later, my dad was excited, and then he told us, now you have someone you can call your grandfather. It was still confusing, we didn't know. And that was just 2 days before the genocide started. So then later in the evening we sat and they called us so they can tell us exactly what was happening because we were all confused. So it happened that this man was my father's uncle. He was my grandfather's younger brother. And I was born in Nyanza, but my parents were both born in Gikongoro. My mother was born in a region called Bufundu that we heard in these testimonies. And my father was born in Bunyambiriri, that's across the river called Rukarara. So they were not far apart. So then they told us the story. In 1960, they relocated the Tutsi by force. So they were capturing them and then load them in trucks and send them to Bugesera. Bugesera was like a jungle, it was a forest, and they threw them there to live there. And that's where the uncle of my father was taken to Bugesera in 1960. And my father never saw him again. And then 3 years later, on Christmas 1993, both my grandfather, Samagwera, who was in Bufundu on my mom's side, and Rutezabiri in Bunyambiri side, they were killed because they were Tutsi on Christmas 1963. Also, to come back to this event that happened in 1960, when they were relocating Tutsi forcibly to Bugesera, it was actually done by the Belgians, because that time, the Rwanda didn't have any military. So it was done by the Belgian together with the Parmehutu militia. To the point that in Bufundu, where they took Mr. Gakwaya, who was my father's uncle, and also my mother's family survived that relocation. It got to a point where they used an helicopter. That's in 1960. Belgium using an helicopter to hunt Tutsis so they can throw them in Bugesera. It was a jungle. There were animals, like they were eaten by lions, by hyenas. Their cows, even themselves, were killed by tsetse flies. And 3 years later, now they killed them. And we never knew any, because like my mother's village, or maybe the majority of the people I knew in our family, we never talked about grandfathers because nobody had a grandfather. And nobody ever told us what was it, what was that. So now, imagine now, my father's uncle and my father now lived in the same country for 30 years, and no one knew the other was alive. And it was on that day that they found out through a friend. And now this man showed up. So this was also the very first time, as kids, they had to sit us down and told us the story about what happened. And it was in detail, and it was graphic, and it was hard. Then, at the end of the conversation, my father asked his uncle, say, look at my children. Which of them looks like their grandfather? And my newfound grandfather, that's how we called him, looked at my brother, said like, this one. And then my father said, so now you guys know, if anything happened to me or your mom, this is gonna be the chief of the family. And I was like, after listening to this story, how they killed my grandfather, now my father says, if anything happened to us, this is gonna be the chief of the family. Then I remember that a year before that, he actually said the same thing to my brother. Say, if I die, or your mom, if something happened to us, how are you gonna raise your brothers? He told my older brother. And that happened because at that specific time, they were killing the Tutsis in Bugesera. That was before the plane. And my father was talking to my brother. You have to be responsible because you never know. So now I went to bed thinking, is these things going to happen to us the same way they just told us? Only 2 days later, it started. So I told you I was born in Nyanza. Nyanza was a place where, like, used to be the safe haven of Tutsi. When they killed my grandparents, of course, my parents had to flee to Nyanza because that was the place where it was supposed to be safe for Tutsi. So even during the genocide, they took their time. There was like just 2 weeks before they started killing us. But not just because they were nice or anything, because there was one of the mayors, the mayor of Nyanza, Mr. Gisagara. He was a Hutu, but really, he's a hero. Because he tried at least for 2 weeks to stop that until they killed him, tied him on a pickup truck, and then dragged him all over the town of Nyanza to show the Hutu, see, this was the Hutu who actually was trying to oppose to what we were trying to do. And that's where they started killing us. But of course, these 2 weeks, our parents had all the information of what was happening around the country. So they tried to find a way to actually send us to safe places. And my father decided to spread us. So he took me and my younger sister in one place, my two brothers in another place, and my mom and my older sister to another house. So most of those houses, they were house of Hutus who were his friends. But my sister, my younger sister and I, he took us because we had one of our auntie who had married a Hutu. And they lived right next door to us, to our house. But my father took us to the parents of my aunt's husband. It was probably about 15 or 20 kilometers from our house. Of course, he was family. His name was Bosco. So we thought he would be able to protect us because he was also an educated person. He was respected in the community. So we thought he would be able to protect us. So me and my sister went to live to Bosco's parents. For a few days, the old man, his father, Bosco's father, really protected us. He protected us from, there was the first raid. When they asked him, who are these kids? He said, these are my grandchildren. Say, why they look like Tutsis? It's like, because their mother is one. So I appreciated what he did on that first raid. The second raid, but before the second raid, something else happened. So my father started been running all over the place, and then he ended up at that house where we were. So I was lucky to see him, to talk to him. It was in the middle of the night. And then he decided not to stay with us because he said it would be unsafe for you guys. So then they negotiated another neighbor who lived across the street, and he accepted to have him in his house. So the second raid came, and again, the old man defended us, said like, yeah, these are my grandkids. But then they went across the street and they found my father. So I saw them celebrating. Actually, after they caught him, they called it a day. So they started dancing, just singing, they were hitting him, and me and my sister were forced to watch that. We were watching that, but we couldn't actually have any reaction because some of the militia still around. So they took him to the killing site. Yeah, we never seen him again after that. But at the same time, we were joined by one of our cousins also, who actually also survived a few killings around and then ended up in that house. And we also had a 4-year-old cousin who her mother left her to us, like to me and my younger sister, said, please take care of her because they will kill us. We don't know, maybe try. So now I had the responsibility with my 9-year-old sister and my 4-year-old cousin. But luckily we were joined by our cousin who was also 15 years old. So then a few days later, maybe a week later, we heard the news that my mom was killed also, but now it was right in our neighborhood where I was born. So my mom was killed, so we found out. Then this one night, just 2 days after my mom was killed, at 3 a.m., we heard this old man came and they woke us up, say like, get out. It was 3 a.m. in the morning. We didn't even know how to get, where to go, because the roads were full of like roadblocks and everything. And it was my first time to go to that area, so I didn't know how to even get back. So, but as kids, we had one thing in mind. So the only person we trusted who could save us was Bosco, the son of the guy who just kicked us out. So then we tried to find our way back to my neighborhood so we can go to Bosco. So we thought Bosco would be so mad at his dad for kicking us out. So luckily one of his cousins actually decided to walk us out, to show us the way, because they didn't want us to be killed around their house. So he took us as far as possible. And I remember he got us to this one place that we were familiar with. It was in Gatagara. And he told us, you know this area, right? Yes. So you see, that's over there is a roadblock. But they are not very tough. But if you're lucky to cross that one, there's another one. That one also is not as tough. After you cross the second one, you'll be gone. You'll be fine. We believed him because he was the guy who actually they used to send back and forth to Bosco's house or doing some errands. So we believed him because we say if he walked us all the way from their house to this area, so he probably know what he's talking about. So we went. So it was a long journey, but this journey was actually how we survived it. It was, I remember, yes, we crossed the first roadblock because there was nobody on the road because they were actually hatching a cow of a Tutsi because we were trying to actually grab the meat to take home. So they were distracted by that, and then we walked by. So the second one was a roadblock again. So this one, they knew me because as a kid, I used to love cows. We had cows at home, and I was so in love with them. And I knew all the cowhands in the area, what we call Abashumba. They were all my friends. And most of them on that roadblock were those guys. And they told me, yeah, we cannot kill you because this, they were telling each other, so this is the kid from the rich. We were not rich. My parents were teachers, but for them, they thought we were rich. Say, this is the kid from the rich family, but who used to hang out with us, so we cannot kill him. So they let us go. Then, actually, the next roadblocks now was the worst. But we didn't know. And we were walking straight to that roadblock. Only one of one of the kids I went to school with actually saw us. And they told us, where are you guys going? We told him. And he was like, no, you cannot do that. So the next roadblock is the most dangerous in the area. And the owner of that roadblock, the chief of it, is my uncle, my my father's brother. So there's no way he can let you guys go. So don't do that. I'll show you another shortcut that I used sometime to come to school. So please use that. And he also said that even if, let's say you have a chance to pass that one, there's another one now. There's actually 3 more that were owned each by brothers. There was 3 brothers. They were known as butchers. They were butchers. That was their job. And they say, even if you have a chance to escape, like my uncle, you won't escape the 3 other roadblocks. And luckily, he saved our life. And there was also, it's a long journey. It actually was probably like 4 hours like walk, but all the things we made, it probably was like a whole day. And remember, we're trying to actually go to Bosco's house because we thought it would be safe there. But on our way, we actually came across with another good person. His name was Kabanda. So it was already daytime, so it was unsafe to continue to walk. So he took us to this one house. Before they go to talk to my aunt and her husband to ask them to protect us. And the house we went to actually happened that was the house where my mom was found. Also, my older sister was in the ceiling of the house. And I was lucky also to chat with my sister because she asked for it. And then I told her we were planning to go to Bosco's house. And my sister was like, no, don't do that. Because Bosco is the one who came to take my mother here to deliver her to the killers. Yeah, that was my aunt's husband who actually delivered my mother to the killers. So that family where my sister was hiding, they have done a lot. Actually, at the beginning, that's where my father went to hide. And they found him, but he ran away. And that's the same place they found my mom and tried to hide my sister. But, of course, they could not have all of us there. But they spent all day. There were 2 sisters, Domitila and Immaculée. And the commander who had just brought us there and his brother. They spent the whole day trying to find a place, a safe place for us. During that day, there was a raid because their house was raided almost every day. And those 2 sisters were trying to help us. They were warned by their brother, who was a policeman, that if they ever find a Tutsi again in their house, he will just kill them. But they did their best. I salute them. And they found us safe places. Now, for the first time now, I was separated by my sister, with my sister. So, of course, it's a long story there. I don't know if I can be able to say all the details like with the time I have. So, but the place where they took me, that they thought would be the safest place. It was actually at their brother's house, the same brother who told them he would kill them, because his wife accepted to hide me because her husband actually never, he lived at the mayor's office, and he had vowed that he would only return to his house after they finish all Tutsis. So now his wife decided to hide me. And I stayed there, because that was the only place, because nobody ever tried to search the house, because they thought no Tutsi would ever be crazy to go hide in the house. But again, a few days later, now they decided, because now there were people coming from Kigali, the presidential guard, they came and had a meeting and say, now we have to search every house, even those houses of the so-called patriots that they never searched. Because his son, the son of that guy, he was actually going to the roadblock and kill people. And every time he comes home, he started bragging, telling me how he killed people, Tutsis and everything. But he told me, you know, little man, I will never kill you unless you ask me for it, because I know how to do it fast and you won't feel any pain. So I'll give you that favor if you want, because my mom told me not to kill you, so I will not do that. But also, if everything finished, because I know at some point we will stop killing the Tutsis, and those who will survive, we'll let them live. If that happened and your sister's still alive, I'll have to marry her. And I say, yes, you could take my sister if you want, but just don't kill me. So then they found out about the news that they were supposed to come do the raid, and my sister was not far from where I was. So then we knew there was a news that there was a priest, there was an Italian priest who had an orphanage, and this man did a lot for us. So whenever you find a way to reach that orphanage as a child, you were safe. But it was hard, again, because now we were, for those who knows probably Nyanza, we were in a place called the Gihisi, but the orphanage was in Nyanza downtown. That was impossible to reach. But those people who were nice to us were actually trying to find a way to get us to that orphanage. But again, the orphanage was between two roadblocks. And one of them was led by a Burundian refugee. And this man was terrible. So many kids were killed trying to reach the orphanage. But once we reached, we were safe, because this Italian, he had an Italian flag, and every time he told them, if you attack this orphanage, it's like you're attacking Italy, the country. So his name was Father Eros, and he managed to save at least 500 of us. And that's where the RPF Inkotanyi soldiers found us. And when they came, actually at that time, the soldiers of the government that was perpetrating the genocide, they were there to kill us. And in Inkotanyi, actually they found out they were in town and they had to run away. Another thing we were scared of when we were at the orphanage, because the orphanage before had at least 150 children, and the majority of them were Hutu, and they were bullying us, they were doing everything, but the priest, of course, had asked them not to do anything. But then I remember when we had hope, because we could listen to the radio, that in Inkotanyi were not far, they were coming to save us, then there was something else that happened. So now these kids, the Hutu kids, they were always going out, going to loot, they come back, and now they had to go to a march to celebrate the arrival of French soldiers that they were considering actually as the one who will support them to stop, who will just help them to stop the RPF. So now, all the hope we had, it just faded, seeing like these kids celebrating the French soldiers coming to support the militia, the government that was killing us. Luckily, Inkotanyi were not far, and they saved us. So, talking about Inkotanyi, I will also say, of course, now, a few months later, for me, I was lucky. They actually adopted me from the orphanage. So I lived with them. It was like now, after losing my parents, after pretty much, I didn't even know some of my siblings were still alive. So it was now, I had now role models. I became a kid again. Because for the last couple months, all we're trying to say, to try to survive, to make it to the next day. But this time, we became children again. They, like the soldier who had adopted me and my cousin, kept us until the school started, probably in October or something. Then we had to go back to school. And that was not easy. Luckily, when I went in this class, but this time I was in Kigali, I met Beata, the lady you just saw on the video, who actually now became like our mother. She was there for everything, and she was passionate. And it's not just me. She helped so many orphans, like young survivors, to cope with all this. And of course, Inkotanyi did not stop there, because the government supported us. They gave us shelters, medical care. They gave us school, everything. And also until there was justice, because at least we knew where my mother was thrown, because it was right in front of our house. So we were able to bury and to have a proper funeral for my mom, like in 1995. But we never knew where my father was thrown, when his body was thrown. We only find out 10 years later, when one of his killers actually confessed and then show us the mass grave where his body was. It's true that it was hard, like even participating in Gachacha and then facing all these killers, but at least it gives so much peace to find the body of your loved ones. Because before you do that, you actually don't believe they went. You always like think they will just pop up one day. And now I'll try to talk about the denial of the genocide. It's, you know, when we talk about the genocide denial, it's so hurtful to the survivors, because the same words, the same rhetoric they were using right before the genocide is exactly the same words they're using now. And what hurts most, like, it's like, now let me speak like a Canadian. So we are in this country where we actually think it's a safe country, like human rights and everything. But it hurts when we see people. Sometimes when we see the genocide perpetrators or their offspring saying that, we understand, because they were doing the same thing even during the genocide, because they always try to find a reason to kill the Tutsi. That's the denial that started right there. So they had to say, every time they went to a Tutsi house and there's a latrine, they say, you see, this hole was dug so they can throw in the Hutus. So now we are killing them before they did. So the same people who used to do that, if they do that now, we will understand. But sometimes when it's done by, let's say, a Canadian who has nothing to do with Rwanda, it really hurts for us. And we don't find it, it's not, I mean, sometimes you don't feel safe, because people do that in the name of freedom of speech. And that's exactly what the radio, RTLM, was doing. They were doing that hate speech in the name of freedom of speech. And it really, it's hard to understand, hard to actually understand that this is done in Canada. And please, my fellow Canadian, I ask you, let's fight this thing. During my story, I told you about my hometown, Nyanza. One of the mayor, Mr. Ugira Shebuja, Celestin, the man behind everything that happened in my hometown, he's actually found safe haven in the UK. He's one of the genocide perpetrators, the 5 genocide perpetrators in the UK, who the government of the UK refused to either send to Rwanda or to bring them to court. They're just free. And this is a guy probably has all the Tutsi in his district. They're on his head. And the same thing, Vincent Zigimfura, one very successful businessman. He's now in Dayton, Ohio. Actually, his daughter tried to find my number and she called me and said, you need to stop what you're trying to do. Because I was just writing on my social media talking about this man. Because they even have the guts to post their pictures on Facebook. That's how I found out he lives in Dayton, Ohio. And his daughter told me, this is not Rwanda. This is the United States. So forget about what you're trying to do. Yeah, that's the life we live as genocide survivors in these countries where we actually supposed to be safe. But we live with that. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Gustave Mukuralinda, pour votre témoignage émouvant. J'aimerais maintenant inviter Madame Sandrine Nkunda ainsi que Deborah Ichirezi qui vont faire une performance pour nous ce soir. Sandrine Nkunda est une poétesse d'origine rwandaise résidant à Gatineau, dont la plume puise l'encre dans la foi, la beauté, la lumière et la résilience. Son écriture voyage entre le français, l'anglais et le kinyarwanda, tisant des ponts entre les cultures et les émotions profondes de l'âme humaine. Rescapée du génocide des Tutsis du Rwanda en 1994, sa poésie est marquée par le travail de mémoire, de transmission, d'hommage et aspire au pansement des blessures. Parallèlement à sa passion pour les mots, Sandrine est titulaire d'un baccalauréat en service social et travaille comme directrice expérience client dans une institution financière. Sandrine, bienvenue.
Merci beaucoup de nous recevoir. Je pense qu'on m'a bien présenté. Alors, on va vous présenter un poème que j'ai intitulé « Ce peuple, mon peuple », où je rends hommage aux personnes que j'ai connues. Puis, donc là, je vais vous laisser suivre ça et je vais être accompagnée par Déborah et Isaac qui vont chanter aussi. Merci beaucoup. Hallucinant, mais bien réel, 31 ans viennent de s'écouler. 31 ans depuis cette matinée du 7 avril 1994, où commença la réalisation du plan le plus monstrueux et le plus abominable qui soit, l'extermination des Tutsis du Rwanda. Ce peuple, mon peuple, longtemps déshumanisé, diabolisé et enfin condamné à mort par son propre pays, ses propres dirigeants, appuyés par certains grands de ce monde, enfin ceux qui se croient l'être. Les plus malins usant de leur pouvoir et intelligence sauvagement diabolique pour manipuler les moins éclairés qui torturèrent les innocents sans aucun état d'âme. Du nord au sud, de l'est à l'ouest, du matin au soir, 7 jours sur 7, et ce, durant 3 mois, ce qu'ils appelaient le travail commença. Du vieillard se tenant à peine debout au futur bébé encore chaud dans le ventre de sa maman, en passant par des hommes, des femmes, des adolescents, nos camarades de l'école primaire, nos meilleurs amis d'enfance. Aucun ne fut épargné. Crime commun et traîné Tutsi.
Kwibuka Kwibuka twiyubaka twiyubaka ntibizongera ntibizongera
Ils leur feront subir les souffrances les plus horribles qu'un être humain puisse imaginer, mais très souvent, celles qui n'auraient jamais pu traverser son esprit. En face de ce qu'ils considéraient comme de simples proies, ces bourreaux débordés d'imagination. Nous n'étions que des enfants. Cependant, quand un enfant est traqué comme un gibier par une bande d'adultes enragés, le poussant à s'imaginer ses propres stratégies de survie, il cesse très vite d'en être un. Ce génocide des Tutsis ayant été parfaitement planifié, imaginez un secours de l'intérieur du Rwanda aurait juste été de l'ordre du rêve, l'hymne national à l'unisson étant « tuez-les tous » jusqu'au dernier, dont l'idée même d'éventrer les femmes Hutus enceintes des bébés Tutsis, parfois tués par les membres de leur propre famille, tellement pathétique et dégoûtant. Malgré la connaissance de cet hymne, la communauté internationale décida de fermer les yeux sur ces atrocités, laissant les nôtres se faire dévorer par ces sans-cœurs qui n'étaient pourtant pas difficiles à maîtriser s'il y avait eu des gens armés, surtout de bonne volonté. Le génocide aurait pu au mieux être empêché, au pire être arrêté dans ses débuts. On aurait peut-être perdu 100 000 personnes, ce qui aurait déjà été énorme, mais Dieu du ciel, pas plus d'1 million et pas en 100 jours. Je suis consciente qu'au Rwanda, il n'y avait ni or, ni diamant, ni pétrole. Mais où est donc passée la part d'humanité en vous? Cette part qui fait de nous qui l'on est réellement et non pas ce que l'on a. Cette part qui nous rappelle que l'autre est notre semblable, peu importe ce que nous en pensons. Cette conscience qui, avant de dormir, nous pousserait à nous arrêter et nous dire « Si c'était mon enfant qui crierait à l'aide en vain, alors que quelqu'un, quelque part, est parfaitement capable d'y répondre, mais choisirait simplement de tourner la tête. » Qu'auriez-vous ressenti à la place des milliers de réfugiés Tutsis assistant à l'abandon total des casques bleus belges agissant sous l'ordre de l'ONU, rapatriant tous les ressortissants occidentaux, y compris leurs animaux de compagnie, alors que les mamans Tutsis laissées à terre les suppliaient de sauver au moins leurs bébés dont la mort devenait de plus en plus imminente? Certains réfugiés désespérés allant jusqu'à se coucher par terre devant les jeeps des casques bleus pour essayer de les empêcher de partir, les suppliant même de les fusiller avant de prendre la route. À cette tentative désespérée, les casques bleus n'ont pas hésité à tirer dans l'air pour se dégager et ils ne savaient que trop bien la suite logique de leur départ. Ils sortaient d'une porte, les génocidaires rentraient de l'autre et s'acharnaient sur tous ces gens laissés sans défense.
Kwibuka, 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 ntibizongera.
À l'humanité d'avoir l'humilité de réfléchir. Quant à moi, je rends hommage aux miens, emportés par cette ignominie humaine. Je me souviens de vous, vous que j'ai côtoyés, que j'ai aimés et qui m'ont aimé. Vous êtes partis, mais vous êtes aussi restés. Vous êtes mes héros, ma force, mon inspiration. 31 ans sont passés, mais cette sensation de comme si c'était hier est omniprésente. J'en déduis que ça restera frais jusqu'à mon dernier souffle. Ce qui n'est pas si mal, car ça me permet de ne jamais vous oublier, ne jamais rien oublier. C'est cette fraîche et douce mémoire qui me permet de parcourir en pensée, maison par maison, ces familles décimées qui vivaient dans ma rue, dont les enfants étaient soit mes cousins, soit mes amis. Et partout sur ma colline, comme on l'appelle si bien chez nous, une colline effacée dont nous ne sommes que des miraculés. De ces ruines au silence assourdissant, j'y revois ce qui fut jadis un voisinage heureux, une enfance dont il ne me reste même pas une photo. Que me resterait-il de vous, si ce n'est la mémoire? J'y tiens. Je me souviens de vous, je revois vos visages, je cite vos noms. Vous avez existé. Vous n'êtes pas des chiffres. Tant que je vivrai, vous vivrez en moi. J'ai survécu pour que vous ne vous éteigniez pas et je dirai aux autres que vous avez vécu. Je vous rends hommage aux si chers rescapés du génocide, mes nouveaux amis, mon autre vie, ma deuxième chance. Vous avez été tellement courageux après votre sortie de l'enfer. Je rends hommage plus particulièrement à tous les orphelins du génocide, de pères et de mères qui n'ont souvent même plus de fratrie, tous emportés dans cette folie. Quand je vous regarde, je crois réellement en la vie, en la force extraordinaire humaine. Et pour vous, je n'ai que de l'admiration. Et que dire de vos parents là-haut? La fierté. Je vous porte également dans mon cœur, très fort. Vous les parents qui avez perdu vos enfants durant le génocide des Tutsis du Rwanda. Ce n'est jamais dans l'ordre des choses, mais vous avez tenu bon et accepté de continuer de vivre malgré votre chagrin. Votre courage est juste sans limite. Pour cette 31e année supplémentaire à ce qui aurait dû être ma vie, je ne manquerai pas de souligner le courage de ceux qui ont osé nous tendre la main en plein milieu de cette folie. Ces Hutus qui ont eu l'audace de rester humains sans rien attendre en retour. Vous étiez extrêmement peu à le faire, ce qui rend votre geste encore plus louable. Certains êtes allés jusqu'à la mort, ne voulant pas trahir vos voisins et amis. Quant à d'autres, vous avez risqué la vie en décidant de nous cacher, alors que nous étions devenus la chose à éviter. Que ce soit pour quelques heures, une nuit, une semaine, chaque minute du génocide des Tutsis comptant pour une éternité, vous avez fait la différence à ce moment précis et notre histoire s'est liée à tout jamais. Enfin, je te rends hommage, toi le soldat par excellence, qui avança vers moi et me dit textuellement, « Petite, je viens vous sauver et vous amener avec moi, toi et tes amis. » Nous étions juste des enfants à cet endroit-là. Oh là là, ce fut et ça restera la meilleure phrase que j'ai entendue de toute ma vie. Était-ce possible et réel que quelqu'un puisse se préoccuper de notre sort et revenir enfin à notre secours? Je l'ai regardé droit dans les yeux pour être sûr qu'il ne se moquait pas de moi. Eh bien non, il était sérieux et il souriait en plus. Et oui, c'était bel et bien un soldat du Front patriotique rwandais.
Kwibuka Kwibuka twiyubaka twiyubaka ntibizongera ntibizongera
Merci infiniment, FPR Inhotanye. Chacun te qualifiera comme il voudra selon son opinion. Mais pour moi, tu es et tu resteras toujours et avant tout celui qui nous retira de la gueule du monstre, qui nous ramena à la vie, qui mit fin au calvaire des Tutsis quand le monde entier en était tout simplement incapable. Je terminerai en soulignant cet élan humain des dernières années, celui de nos terres d'accueil à travers le monde, en particulier ici au Canada. Ces amis des Rwandais, sincèrement touchés par notre histoire, comprenant enfin que ce n'est pas qu'une histoire rwandaise, mais celle de l'humanité frappée en son sein il y a tout juste 31 ans. Nous voilà survécus au génocide des Tutsis du Rwanda. Nous voici vivants et regardant l'avenir. Nous voici raconter notre histoire et celle des nôtres. Nous voici tenant en main la flamme qui ne s'éteindra jamais. Ni ici ni ailleurs, plus jamais ça.
turibuka turibuka twiyubaka twiyubaka ntibizongera 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 ntibizongera
Following the moving poetry performance by Sandrine Ngundgwa, it is my privilege to introduce Major Lancaster. Serving as military assistant to the United Nations Force Commander in Rwanda from May 1994 to May 1995, Major Lancaster was often at the forefront of coordinating operations during one of the most challenging times of our history. Please join me in welcoming Major Lancaster.
Excellencies, honorable members of the diplomatic and government communities here in Canada, members of the Rwandan community, and friends in memory. I should start by saying that I feel very, very inadequate to speak to you today on this subject. The testimony that we've heard, and indeed the video that we saw, says most of what I would have wanted to say if I'd had the eloquence to say it. So conscious of the try and limit my remarks to the few things that I think might add to the occasion. It's been 31 years since the unimaginable happened in Rwanda. I was a witness to some of it, and my life has been strangely tangled with events in the region ever since. Though I was never a direct target of the killings, like so many here, I've had to live with the awful knowledge of what happened. And please pardon me, I have bad allergies this time of year, and my voice fades in and out. At the same time, I've had to live with the shame of being part of an organization that failed in its most fundamental mission to stop a genocide. But today, rather than speak in depth about the many factors that led to the genocide or dwell on what I saw at the time, I'd like to focus on only one of the factors that enabled the genocide of the Tutsi, a genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda in 1994. The demonization of Tutsis as part of a genocidal ideology. I believe this is important not only because it played such a significant role in the genocide and is still part of political discourse in Eastern DRC and indeed much of Central Africa, but also because we're at a moment in history where we should be able to see the link between the destruction of international cooperation and the strategic use of conspiracy theories. This is happening now all around us. Now, I have personal experience of the virulent anti-Tutsi sentiment still active in parts of Africa and often visible inside some of the international institutions that are supposed to stand against this sort of thing. I find the consistency or the persistence of such conspiracy-loaded drivel both surprising and deeply disappointing, particularly for someone of my generation that should be able to make a direct link between Hitler's use of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. The parallels between that period and what happened during, leading up to and during the genocide are unmistakable. We should know by now the consequences of hate speech. Now, we've already heard quite eloquently about the deep current of anti-Tutsi resentment created under colonial influence that provided the basis for so much of the propaganda and information warfare that were part of the perpetrator's strategy before, during, and after the genocide. And though much has been written about the genocide, very little attention has been given to its long-term effects or to lessons that might be universally relevant. It sometimes seems to me as though the world is a little too eager to forget. To truly understand how Rwanda's two major ethnicities could have come to hate and mistrust each other so deeply, one must consider the enormous distortions of colonization. Now, very few people have looked carefully at the history of Rwanda in pre-genocide times. Indeed, there's not much written, or at least pre-colonial times. But you do find reference in literature on the slave trade to the fact that Rwanda was one of the only parts of Africa that resisted it, whose leaders did not sell off their own people into slavery, and who did not engage in slave raiding into other territories. I'd suggest that this is the strongest indication we could hope for of social and political solidarity prior to the arrival of the colonial forces. Now, Europeans arrived in the late 1800s with some more advanced technology, but it was wrapped up in a blinding sense of their own innate superiority and a keen awareness of the practical difficulties of colonization. The easiest way for them to dominate was to exploit existing power structures and divide the colony into what amounted to a class of trustees and a class of slaves, which they justified through the dubious pseudoscience of eugenics. Their initial policy excluded Hutu from positions of power within the colonial system, and it sowed seeds of resentment that fueled the zero-sum approach to politics that later emerged at independence. To make matters worse, after the Second World War, Belgian authorities switched preferences and began to support the Hutu majority, seemingly blaming the Tutsis for the inequalities that they themselves had created. Suffice to say, for the moment, that by the time the colonial structure fell apart, any shred of the social cohesion that might have been present in pre-colonial Rwanda had disappeared. And by the late 1950s, Rwanda had become a divided polity, struggling under the yoke of embittered identity politics, fueled by genocidal narratives, already fueled by genocidal narratives. It's important, I think, to understand that this indifference to the effect of colonial-era corruption in Rwandan society was mirrored later in the international failure to give sufficient weight to the inner tensions in Rwanda at work leading up to the genocide. By that point, Rwanda could have been described as the scene of a massive hostage-taking in which the majority Tutsi population were held as guarantee against the return of the Tutsi diaspora. The Hutu population had become co-opted into the role of jailers and later executioners by an ethnic elite dedicated to Hutu power. The majority population had been conditioned to a deep level of cynicism that made inter-ethnic trust virtually impossible. The strident and unyielding demonization of the Tutsi, which characterized the tone of public discourse, became increasingly frenzied in the hands of Hutu hardliner mouthpieces. And I suspect that most of you know the story much better than I do. Yet somehow, none of this was obvious to international observers at the time. I don't know how we could have missed it. Just as a little explanation, so the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, that is in charge of setting up and running peacekeeping missions for the United Nations, always starts by sending in somebody to do an initial reconnaissance. In this case, they sent in an old friend of mine who went to the same staff college. And somehow, in his short visit to Rwanda, he had a fairly good handle on the number of troops on both sides of the equation, had a fairly good understanding of the terrain and the logistics implications, but he completely missed the factor represented by a mobilized hate-driven civilian population. Missed it. He wrote a report that aligned only too well with the UN's desire to scale back their international involvements after their disaster in Somalia just a few months earlier. At no point in UN deliberations did the problem of genocidal ideology come to the fore. On the contrary, the diplomatic community seemed convinced that rational diplomacy would prevail, and the international military community did not see the problem as warranting more than a token number of troops, and that's what was deployed. Now, as has been mentioned in the introduction, I was present in Kigali from early May to the end of the genocide and for nearly a year afterwards. When I arrived, the rhetoric on RTLM was just off the chart, encouraging genocidaires to fill the Nyarabongo River with Tutsi to send back to Ethiopia. We know this story. The most significant weapon in the hands of the perpetrators of the genocide was their ability to convince so many that their survival depended on the eradication of the Tutsi population. This was only effective because it lent itself to a twisted, colonially implanted false narrative. I'd just like to mention at this point in passing Opération Turquoise and the tragic consequences for the transmission of ideology that this allowed. Turquoise, as you remember, set up a screen across Western Rwanda that was sold to the UN as an attempt to protect civilians. It may have done a little bit of that, but in fact, it provided a screen behind which the perpetrators and planners of the genocide were able to flee. They got across the border into the camps in Zaire, and there they began their work again. Now, for the new Rwandan government at the end of the genocide, once military success was achieved, the stark challenges of rebuilding a functioning state were overwhelming and urgent. The population, as most of you know at the time, consisted of a remnant Hutu bloc of thoroughly conditioned people, conditioned by years of anti-Tutsi propaganda, which had convinced so many of them that a Tutsi victory would mean their own death. Remembering that the killings had happened at the hands of civilian mobs, many of the surviving majority had blood on their hands and must have feared reprisal at the same time that they may have felt deep guilt for what they'd done. In the midst of this terrified majority lived a small number of severely traumatized survivors, whom we've heard mentioned today, and I would assume that many are in this room today. Fear and mistrust were everywhere. RPF fighters, many of whom had been recruited only once the genocide had started, were thinly stretched and exhausted. The RPF could not govern without trust and realized this, yet could not themselves trust the intentions of the defeated majority. Intensely felt vulnerability on all sides, combined with very real risks of further violence to create a poisonous climate in which all motives were suspect. And just over the border, the proper propaganda machine that had powered the genocide was back in action, mixing toxic anti-Tutsi rhetoric with a credible military threat. And worse, again, the machine was now protected by UN humanitarian agencies who looked at the people in the camps and saw only victims, not perpetrators. Now, as luck would have it, I was back in Rwanda in the summer of 1996 near Kibuye on Lake Kivu. There were raids launched from across the lake every night from the camps. People were killed, cattle were stolen, and the new Rwandan government still struggling to restore order and restore governance capacity, appealed again and again to the UN to stop the raids, to move the refugees away from the border as per international requirements. They refused. Once again, the international community failed to hear Rwanda's call for help. In the end, frustrated by lack of response, Rwandan troops crossed the border and repatriated the bulk of the refugees themselves, but not all. Extremist elements hung on in the chaos of eastern Zaire as it became DRC, and they developed armed groups that are still active today. Poison is still working. In 2007, 2008, I led a small UN peacekeeping team in DRC tasked with achieving the voluntary disarmament and repatriation of all foreign armed groups, but most particularly the FDLR and their associate group, Rud Uranana, led by none other than General Musare. There were hardline Hutu power holdouts dedicated to the overthrow of the Rwandan government. I can't tell you how many hours I spent listening to justifications of the genocide as I sat face to face with FDLR and RUD leaders, hoping always for some vestige of rationality that I could understand. Despite the fact that they were the ones that had perpetrated the genocide, they were deeply convinced that they were in the right and were so cynical of Rwandan government intentions that they wanted to finish what they had started. The consistent theme in every encounter was that the Tutsi were evil and had to be eliminated, could not be dealt with. Yet my own monitoring through the UN system and through colleagues working in Rwanda, my own monitoring of FDLR fighters who took advantage of the offer of demobilization and repatriation were dealt with very, very well. Almost all of them, I think it was an 83% success rate, which is unheard of in the field of demobilization. 83% of them successfully reintegrated into their home communities. Over the next few years, I worked with several different UN or international organizations trying to deal with a global network of Hutu extremists supporting Rwandan armed groups in DRC. I devoted a huge amount of time to fighting senior UN and national government officials who refused to take seriously detailed reports of ongoing FDLR atrocities or to investigate verifiable details of responsibility. Trying to stimulate concern about genocidal ideology proved fruitless, in part because most of the world has been infected with mistrust of Rwandan motives. Now, my team's had some small successes, like the prosecution of the president and vice president of the FDLR, who at that time were operating out of bases in Germany. They're now in jail. But we had more failures than successes. For instance, government of DRC and senior UN officials in MONUSCO at that time still refused to stop working with known génocidaires. They used them as collaborators and used them in negotiations and to inform negotiations with Rwanda. I even ran into, when I was for a very short period leading the group of experts for the sanctions monitoring in DRC, I ran into problems here in Canada, trying to get Canadian authorities to look at the cases that we had investigated concerning links between RUD and FDLR leaders living in Canada and what was happening on the ground in DRC. In the end, the international community did what it always does, simply looked away. Yet the FDLR survives. They've developed a wide network of influence and continue to play a role in Congolese politics, primarily by provoking anti-Congolese Tutsi sentiment and offering their services to fight against the armed group known as M23. The demonstrable fact that M23 arose as a survival imperative in the face of genocidal tendencies towards Congolese Tutsis is quickly forgotten in the rush to accuse Rwanda of using M23 to get their hands on Congolese minerals. This is the worst kind of projection of values. I suggest there's a theme running through the entire history of the region constituted by the willful refusal of international leaders to take seriously the dangers of genocidal thinking. They didn't listen before the genocide when FPR leaders insisted that a peacekeeping mission would need to be strong enough to protect their people from the passions lurking in the shallows of negotiations. They would not believe their own military representative, General Dallaire, in the region in the weeks immediately before the genocide when he sent his famous fax of 11th of January, 1994, warning of what was coming. They refused to believe that a genocide was underway until far too late for the victims, even weeks after the horrors had become so clear. And they've consistently ignored the very real dangers of the anti-Tutsi mentality undermining peace in DRC and that the government of Rwanda has been trying to explain ever since 1994. The day the shooting stopped after the genocide, the new government faced a hard choice between a focus on vengeance and a focus on reconstruction. In their effort to find a path between the desire to see the perpetrators of the genocide punished and their hopes for a society built on unity and trust, they ultimately focused on unity. The post-genocide security conditions were extreme, yet in the end, the fledgling government picked a careful way through a minefield of resentment and fear to build solidarity in the face of cynicism. Perhaps their most important achievement was to decolonize their minds by throwing off the bogus ethnic divisions to focus on unity. And perhaps there's a lesson here for other nations struggling now against the effects of conspiracy theory and fear-mongering. For Rwanda, the bitter lessons of being abandoned during the genocide have been turned into an argument for self-reliance. Having learned not to trust the fiction of international instruments or institutions that make empty promises backed up by member states who have no interest in delivering on those promises, they've learned to rely on themselves for justice and security. Against vigorous critique from United Nations Human Rights Commission and others, they developed a gacaca system to try to resolve tensions among the many hundreds of thousands of victims and perpetrators living side by side with the consequences of a genocide. So today, after watching the international community consistently fail to resolve chaos in Eastern DRC, 30 years of failure, is it any surprise that they have little hope that the dangers just over their border from the deadly combination of violent chaos and toxic genocidal ideology would ever be contained through law, international action, or bilateral agreements? Much as we might want to deplore what is happening in Eastern DRC today, mistaking its causes would be consistent with our past, but quite wrong. If anti-Semitism is a danger that draws world attention in a collective response, so is anti-Tutsyism. When senior Rwandan officials speak of its dangers, we might do well for once to listen. Thank you.
Thank you, Major Lancaster, for your heartfelt speech. I would now like to invite the president of the Humura Association to come and give us a speech. J'aimerais maintenant inviter le président de l'association Humura, Monsieur Pascal Kanyemela. Merci.
I was tasked to deliver the closing remarks for today's event, but apparently we are running out of time, so I will try to be brief as much as possible. Excellencies, ambassadors, dear friends, representatives of local communities, survivors of the genocide against the Tutsi, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I want to thank Gustav for giving his testimony. It's not easy to come up for here and deliver your testimony in front of a live audience. Thank you very much. Je suis aussi à saluer les représentants des communautés Banyamulenge qui sont ici et autres Tutsi congolais. À cette occasion de commémoration, nous exprimons notre solidarité avec vous. Vos communautés sont victimes de discrimination et extermination depuis des années. Votre souffrance fait écho à l'histoire tragique dont nous nous souvenons aujourd'hui. Thank you for being here. I'm also deeply moved by the presence of so many survivors here today, especially young people. 31 years later, after one of the darkest chapters in human history, your resilience, perseverance, and unwavering commitment to remembrance continue to inspire us all. However, as we commemorate, we must also confront a growing threat, the rise of genocide denial and the spread of hate speech, particularly in the digital spaces. The proliferation of misinformation and disinformation, often amplified by ongoing conflict such as the M23 crisis in Eastern DRC, fuel dangerous revisionist narrative. This narrative disrespects survivors and discredits the memory of the victims. Nous n'avons pas le droit de garder le silence. Le déni du génocide n'est pas une opinion, c'est une attaque. Ne rien faire, c'est trahir une deuxième fois les victimes du génocide. Notre devoir est de faire entendre la vérité, de protéger l'histoire et résister à ceux qui veulent l'effacer. No survivors should bear the added burden of seeing their pain denied or minimized. And so, as the ceremony concludes, I want to share with you a message of hope and action. Despite our annual commemoration, one essential element is still missing: a permanent memorial space here in Ottawa. A place where survivors, their families, and the future generation can gather, reflect, and learn. Today, I'm pleased to announce a major milestone. We now have a finalized design of the monument and also the cost estimation of the monument. It was developed, the design was developed by a student from the University of Rwanda, and the estimate was made also by the local firm that has more experience in this kind of project. We were given this information last week, so we didn't have enough time to share either the design by the picture or video today. But very soon, we will find the time to launch this initiative officially. If you feel to support this important initiative, please pick up the information available at the door. I'll be standing by the door and give you small paper showing you how you can contribute. Every contribution, large or small, brings us closer to making this memorial a reality. Just to put into context, this monument will cost a lot of money. I was checking these numbers last Friday. It's close to 1.4 million. So I know we are in a really hard economic situation right now. That's why every little contribution from you, it's going to make a huge difference. En conclusion, au nom de l'association Humura et les rescapés de la région, je tiens à exprimer ma plus profonde gratitude au Haut Commissariat de la République du Rwanda au Canada pour l'excellente organisation de cette journée de commémoration. Les efforts déployés pour que tout se déroule dans les meilleures conditions témoignent de l'importance que vous accordez à cette date. Au nom des rescapés de la région d'Ottawa et Gatineau, je vous remercie sincèrement. Mesdames et messieurs, chers compatriotes et distingués dignitaires, les activités officielles de la 30e commémoration du génocide contre les Tutsis du Rwanda se tiendront à partir d'aujourd'hui jusqu'au 31 mai 2025 dans notre région. Pour le programme détaillé, veuillez consulter nos plateformes officielles. Mukomeze mwihangane kandi uko no kubivuga ngo tume twibuke twiyubaka. Murakoze.
Hello. Thank you so much again for being here, for attending. We're very grateful. As we close, we'd like to remind you that there's more events coming in the following days. There is Kujichaniro on the 12th, and there's more events by the Humura Association, like mentioned previously, which will take place, so please stay tuned. Thank you.
Merci, mesdames et messieurs, pour votre présence aujourd'hui. On l'apprécie. Veuillez rester en contact avec Humura pour les événements à venir. Et on aimerait aussi vous inviter à Kudichaniro qui prendra place le 12 avril à 4 heures. Vous êtes les bienvenus. Passez une merveilleuse journée. Et l'exhibition est ouverte. Si vous n'avez pas eu la chance d'y passer avant de venir, vous êtes les bienvenus à y passer. Bonne journée.